Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion. Interestingly enough, I think this is one of the best formats for Ghost Bell basically ever since the card came out. Usually this card was more of like a niche side deck options for maybe like 1 or 2 matchups in the format. I think right now you could realistically main deck Bell. Like I think Bell is really strong right now. Non-engine in the current format. And when I say current format, I mean Doom of Dimensions format, because that's what everyone cares about, of course, for YCS Lille and YCS Anaheim. The landscape has changed in the current format, and I want to talk about that for a second before we jump into the individual cards. With decks like Draco Tail, Mitsurugi, Yami, and maybe Lunalight taking a little bit more spotlight right now, I think it is a little bit of a different environment than what we had in the last format. So, and I think something like K9 Crystron, Gem Knight, Sky Striker, Orcust, Mitsurugi, hybrid variations maybe, or like Heraldic Ryziel or something like that. With that in mind, we're going to go over these cards. I'm going to tell you whether I like them or I dislike them, and I'm going to tell you in which matchups I think they are good, and whether I would consider main decking them or side decking them only. So, back row removal in the form of something like Harpy's Feather Duster, I think is in a solid spot right now. I would not recommend main decking it in anything that isn't like maybe a Sky Striker deck or like a blind second deck in general. But I think in general, having access to Feather Duster is pretty solid in a lot of matchups, you know, against decks like Mitsurugi, being able to force the counter trap immediately. I mean, counter trap. Or like if they don't go for the counter trap, then you're gonna like hit the prayers, the Magatama, and any imperms that they said immediately. So that's nice. Against Yami, they're gonna have to use the Herald Negate on it if they don't want to use the Surprise and Field Spell and any other spells they said. So I think it's a pretty high value card. It's not going to win any matchup on its own because most decks have good boards outside of their spell traps, but it's a decent card. Against Draco Tail, if your deck really struggles with Draco Tail Flame, you can also use back row removal to force the flame. That's not a good exchange for you, but it works. Called by the Grave is a very good card in this format. It depends a little bit on your deck. If your deck struggles with cards like Ash Blossom, which some decks do, some decks don't, then I think Called by the Grave is a very main deckable card. But I think it's also just like a really good side deck card for going first in general. I think what makes Called by the Grave exceptionally strong this format is the fact that it is good going second in a lot of matchups. Against Yami, you can negate Herald of the Arclight. Against Mitsurugi, you can hit the Murakumo or the Futsu or whatever. Against Draco Tail, you can hit the 5 mana. So it's a really strong card at even hitting engine cards when you're going second, which is different from last format where decks like Vanquish Soul didn't really care about Called by the Grave at all. I think it's very good. Dominus Impulse is a staple card if your deck can play it. It is one of the strongest hand traps in the format right now. I think the only deck that it's arguably not crazy against is Yami, but even against Yami, it has very solid applications. You can either choose to use it as a hand trap and hope they don't have the extender necessary to play through it, or you can hold it for your own turn to play through a card like Yami Surprise or when the Synchros are tagging out. So Impulse, really high quality card, very good against Mitsurugi, very good against Draco Tail, and obviously also a strong hand trap against something like Lunalight. So if your deck can play Impulse, you should probably play Impulse. Retaliating Sea is also a very, very good card this format. Obviously, I think it's more suited as a side deck card, but it is very strong against Draco Tail. Even in the versions that play Cartesia to play around it a little bit, you're going to be able to hit a Rahu or a K2 eventually. So Retaliating Sea hurts Draco Tail in almost all of its versions. It is also pretty good against something like Lunalight and has some random applications in some other matchups. Like, for example, against Sky Striker, you can counter linkage with it, which is relevant sometimes. You could also consider it against Yami, depending on the deck you're playing, because if they use the Surprise, you can chain Retaliating Sea, and then the Surprise gets banished, which is neat. And also if they start with Hornet Drones or Obedience Schooled, which is now limited, but still really, really good side deck card. I think with Draco Tail now being in more of a spotlight position in the metagame, I think you're going to see a lot more Retaliating Seas, and I think Draco Tail really needs to worry about that and really find a solution. Ash Blossom is also a staple card this format with very little surprise. I think the only deck that plays through Ash Blossom very well is Yami, but even Yami, you can hit some of their starters. You know, sometimes you can just Ash Engage, or you can Ash Piri Rise Map or Ash Obedience Schooled, and they might not have a play after. If they start with the monsters, the Ash Blossom will not actually stop the combos, but other than that, really high quality card against Draco Tail, really high quality card against Mitsu, very versatile card in any other matchup. So I think most decks are going to want to play Ash Blossom. In general, I think board breakers are also in a pretty good spot right now. So like cards like Ash Blossom being good does not mean you have to play it in every single deck. Like if you decide to play a board breaker deck and not include Ash because of that, I think that's valid. And ultimately, there are still going to be some K9 decks out there that Ash is not going to be great against, because if you Ash against K9, you are at risk of getting just like extended on with like Izuna. So just because I called this category staple does not really mean you have to. I guess I should just make it like extremely good or something like that. Yeah, because staple means you have to play it in every deck, which is not the case with this card. But they are very, very good. Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion. Interestingly enough, I think this is one of the best formats for Ghost Bell basically ever since the card came out. Usually this card was more of like a niche side deck options for maybe like 1 or 2 matchups in the format. I think right now you could realistically main deck Bell. Like I think Bell is really strong right now. Just to name a couple of interactions that you can do with Bell. Bell is obviously really strong against Mitsurugi Prayers and all of the Mitsurugi Ritual Graveyard effects, because you can negate the Search and the Revive. It is very strong against Draco Tail to Bell the trap cards. What you're trying to do, most Draco Tail players are playing 2 Draco Tail traps. So if you Bell the second one, it will not shuffle back the first one, and then they are left without any traps in the deck, and it basically ruins their grind game, because they're gonna run out of spell traps. So if you play a grindy deck, Bell is really good against Draco Tail for you. Against Yami, when you play into a Yami board, you can Bell the Synchros when they try to tag out, which can be very, very crucial in certain moments against Yami, but you can also use it against some one-card combos by Yami. For example, if they start with Cookie or Lollipo or Marshmallow, if you Bell the minion to revive, they need an extender, otherwise they cannot play through the Bell. So Bell, really high quality cards in those 3 matchups. Also happens to be very good against Sky Striker, because you can Bell Kagari and Sky Striker is 0. So really good format for Bell. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some success of main deck Bell in this format. Chalice, I think, has been a decent option in the last format. Maybe if you wanted to worry about turn 0 plays like Holy Sue and Izuna, both of those have become way less relevant. So Chalice is a pretty situational card. I don't think I would recommend main decking Chalice in anything. The only decks that maybe could consider playing Chalice are decks that mainly care about Herald of the Arclight against Yami. But even then, you're probably better off playing something like Imperm, Droplet. There's better options available for Forbidden Chalice. Cosmic Cyclone, I think, is a mediocre card now. I did say when we discussed non-engine for the last format before Doom of Dimension, I saw some use cases for Cosmic Cyclone, specifically for the Yami matchup, because banishing their field spells was actually really painful for the deck. However, now that Marshmallow is going to be out, they're going to have a way easier time recycling those banished field spells, so that is no longer a win con against the deck. And so I think Cosmic Cyclone just loses a lot of its appeal, and I wouldn't recommend playing it. It's not like bad, but it's definitely mediocre. Board breakers in the form of Raigeki and Darkhole, I think are pretty solid. They are situational in the sense that like you can't play them in every single deck, I don't think, because they just don't make that much sense. But if you're playing a full board breaker deck like Sky Striker, I think Raigeki is a pretty solid option, because most boards are either going to get completely obliterated by it, or it's going to force out an Omni Negate. That's the thing, right? It's like, if your opponent really cares about the board, they can negate it with Herald of the Arclight, they can negate it with Draco Tail Flame, and against Mitsurugi, the Raigeki is like fine. But it doesn't do anything against Lunalight, because at this point, like, if you're playing a board breaker deck, if they make Liger, you're going to be in trouble already. So overall, pretty solid though. I liked it. I played Sky Striker at locals, and I played some Raigekis, and they were pretty good in my opinion. Book of Eclipse, I think, has lost a decent amount of value. I still think it is a solid board breaker. I don't think it's my favorite anymore. I think it's valid against Yami. However, I don't love it against Mitsurugi at all. It's very easy for Mitsurugi to recover from Book of Eclipse, because they can just tribute their set like Murakumo or Futsu or whatever for prayers, and then just everything comes back in face up. And they also have IP on the board usually, and so, you know, like you basically have to hold Book of Eclipse and then chain it to the IP so that they can't link, but then you're also eclipsing your own stuff, and I don't know, I'm not sure. Also, going first, it does nothing against Mitsu pretty much. Like maybe you prevent a rank 4, but like the rest of the plays are still gonna go through. It's a pretty good breaker against Yami, pretty inconsequential against Mitsu and Draco Tail, so I don't love it, but it could be all right. If Yami is your worst matchup, I think it could be okay, but I think there's going to be better options for that. So maybe I'll actually demote it to situational. I'm not a huge fan of it. Evenly, on the other hand, I think has solid applications this format. I think decks like Draco Tail and Pure Mitsurugi have their weaknesses to evenly matched. Of course, giving up your battle phase is rough. In some board breaker decks, you're going to draw some cards, like for example in Sky Striker, this card has some risks because you might draw into it with Engage and then you might not be able to use it anymore. But it's got some pretty solid use cases. I would not recommend main decking it, but I think it is a decently positioned side deck card in the current format in the right deck with the right approach. What I don't think you would want to do is play evenly in a deck that already plays hand traps. So if you are choosing to play cards like Ash Bell, Impulse, Retaliating Sea or whatever, I would not recommend playing evenly, which is different to some other board breakers, like something like Eclipse or even some of the ones we're talking about later down the line. They can be paired with hand traps, you know, like you can just hand trap your opponent and then super poly the remaining stuff they have, but that doesn't really work that well with evenly. Fenrir. I think Fenrir is a pretty solid card this format. I think it's going to make some boards stronger going first. One thing you have to take into account with Fenrir is some decks might have lines to play around Nibiru, and Fenrir might change those because it's going to be an extra summon. So what normally would have been summon 4 is now going to be summon 5, and that could be a problem depending on how your deck plays under Nib. My problem with Fenrir is that I feel like going first, it's a really strong disruption. However, going second, I am not sure how high quality of a board breaker it really is, but it's definitely not bad. I'd have to try it more. I haven't been playing Fenrir a lot in most of my decks because I was prioritizing other cards that conflict with Fenrir, like Bestials or Izuna or Phantasme or Impulse or Nibiru. Like, I think that's the biggest problem for Fenrir going second, is that it just conflicts with other cards that I like more. So if I have to decide between Fenrir and Phantasme in my side deck, I personally prefer Phantasme. So I'm gonna not play the Fenrir because of that. Infinite Impermanence. I think it is good, but I think it also is a little bit weird because it's not that good against Yummy. Against Draco Tail, it feels solid, but it also feels a little bit hit or miss because sometimes, you know, they go normal summon Lucius and you're in that position where you're like, should I imperm this Lucius now? Because they might just not have a way to fuse. But then if I do imperm and they have 5 mana, they might like dodge it. Against Yummy, I'm going to be honest with you, against Yummy, you're probably best off just holding it for your turn if your deck struggles with the Herald, but you can do that. Against Mitsurugi, it is only okay. I think it's probably one of the weaker formats for Imperm. I'm going to be honest with you. It's not bad. If you're looking for like the best 12 or 15 hand traps, the Imperm is probably part of that in the main deck, but I don't think it classifies as a very good card. Like, I genuinely am currently, even in some of the decks that I'm playing hand traps in, I'm considering not playing Imperm. But it can be played. It has some advantages. Notably, I think it is one of the best cards against K9 decks because hitting the new K9 normal summon with Imperm is super clean. So if you're worried about that, you might still want to play Imperm and you might still want to side it maybe for that matchup because then they cannot extend with Izuna. Izuna is a very good card this upcoming format. I think just as a raw hand trap, I think it does a decent amount of things. I believe one of the main things that changed about Izuna is that it can now also sometimes be used against Yummy. Not always, because your Yummy opponent can still choose to play around the Izuna by not activating the Marshmallow in hand, but not every Yummy opponent is going to play around Izuna at any point in time. Some are going to decide to play into it at certain moments because sometimes it's the correct thing to do, which means that the Izuna is now no longer dead 100% of the time. It is now live a decent chunk of your games. You might still side deck it out against Yummy. That's something you might want to do. But like against all the other decks, Draco Tail, Mitsurugi, Lunalight even, like it's going to be live basically every time and very early on in their turns. So you can basically choose when you use it. The only thing that Izuna depends on is, of course, you need space in your extra deck. Not every deck can afford to do that. Not every Draco Tail variation can. Like, for example, if you choose to play the Magistus cards in Draco Tail or the Dragon Maid cards or whatever, then you're going to struggle to fit the Exceeds for Izuna. But I do think it is, in itself, a pretty good hand trap, this format that is live against most matchups. I will say though, in most of the matchups where it's live, it doesn't like immediately auto win you the matchup. It's just a solid card. Like if you drop an Izuna against Mitsurugi, it's not instantly winning you the game, because you probably have to discard another card if you want it to resolve for the Murakumo, and then you get a rank 4 and that's a rank 5, and that's annoying for your opponent, but it doesn't automatically win you the game. But it's a high quality hand trap nonetheless. Artifact Lancia, I believe, goes into the situational category. I'm not gonna lie, there are matchups for this card, namely Malice, if it's still being played, Crystron K9 if it's still being played, and Lunalight, which I'm pretty sure is going to be played. I think those 3 matchups Lancia is pretty solid in. However, are those 3 matchups really relevant enough for you to use side deck space on it? Because there's a lot of other things running around, and I don't know if those decks are high priority enough to play a super specific card for those matchups. I guess Orchist is a good point. Yes, Orchist, the Lancia also has an application. So I think if your deck struggles with those matchups, or if you just expect a decent amount of those decks, then I think playing Lancia is valid. I don't think it's bad. In my head, it's just a little bit situational. Like, I could see myself playing it if I just struggle so much against those matchups that I really want a specific card for it and I can afford it, because maybe if your deck has like a good matchup against Mitsu and Draco Tail, and that's why you don't have to spend much side deck for those, and you have extra room, then Lancia is completely fine. Mourner, I see no reason to play at the moment. I think the applications for it are just a little bit too few and far between. I already think Valor is not going to be that great. Mourner just being like basically a version of Valor is tough for it. I think with cards like Imperm and Valor already being not that high priority, I think Mourner just shouldn't see play this format. You can use it on your turn 1. The problem with Mourner on turn 1 in the TCG is that it's a trigger effect. So it does not work on Arthalion on your turn. If your opponent goes by mana effect, make Arthalion, the Mourner has to be Chainlink 1 and the Arthalion is going to be like Chainlink 2 or higher, and then it's going to resolve and then be negated afterwards. That's why Mourner is like pretty bad. Yeah, overall mediocre. Charmies. I think the landscape for Charmies has changed a little bit. I think Mulcharmy Meowls is a pretty situational card. I'm struggling to find really good matchups for it. I think the best matchup for Meowls is when you use it on your own turn against Yummy. It can be quite annoying. However, I don't think that's enough reason to play it. Like, I don't want to play a Charmy that I have to hold until my own turn and then activate it in the draw phase. I don't like that. In most other matchups, I'm not a big fan of Meowls. I think with Malice out of the format, it's a little mid. It has applications against Mitsurugi, but I'm gonna be honest with you, I think there's much better things you can do against Mitsu. Like, basically, in order for you to plus off of a Meowls against Mitsu, they have to summon like multiple times from the graveyard, and that means every time they do that, they search and summon back. So they basically, every time they use a ritual graveyard effect, they get 2 cards, you get 1. That means it doesn't even really discourage them from doing it like once or twice. Like, yeah, if you draw 2 cards off Meowls, it was technically decent, but they also generated like 4 cards in the process. So yeah. Also, they can just search and not summon back, which sometimes isn't even that bad for pure Mitsu. Huvalos, on the other hand, I think it's at least very good. I'm not sure, because the decks in the format right now, like, basically there's like one half of the decks that are pretty solid into Fuva, actually, like Draco Tail and Mitsurugi. Against those decks, you don't really need Fuva. However, there's another half of the decks in the format where Fuva is going to be very strong, which I think is why I'm still going to put it in extremely good. But it's not as dominating as it once was with like Malice, Ryzeal format. But right now, like Yummy, Lunalight, K9 variations, I think the Fuva is still really good against, and basically like a really, really important failsafe that like you take the risk of drawing it going first. Because I mean, against Draco Tail and Mitsu going second, it's still fine. It's not bad. It's still a good card to have when you go second. And so I think it gives you a very nice safety net against like the higher ceiling decks in the format, while still being decent against Draco Tail and Mitsu. It's dead going first, but a lot of decks have great ways to make use of it. Like, for example, Draco Tail can fuse away, Yummy can discard it for Cupsy, Mitsurugi can overlay into a level 4. So most decks are fine with drawing a Fuva going first as long as you can play. So I think it still qualifies as an extremely good card that you should play in most decks if you can. Purulia, with the absence of Ryzeal, or mostly absence of Ryzeal, I think Purulia becomes more of a situational card. I actually don't love Purulia right now. It was good against K9 Vanquish Soul because it discouraged them from extending and extending and extending, because most of the Vanquish Soul summons were from hand. However, against something like K9 Crystron, I feel like they can still basically pop off while giving you like 1 or 2 draws. So I don't think Purulia is that good, to be honest. Like, I think most matchups don't care enough. Against Mitsurugi, they can go full combo with 2 draws. or they can just go for a slightly adjusted combo and give you 0 draws sometimes, or just 1. And I think the same is true for Yummy, the same is true for Draco Tail. Draco Tail sometimes can just play without a normal summon. If you Purulia them in draw phase, they might just decide not to normal summon, give you 0 draws, and outgrind you from there. So I'm not a fan of Purulia right now. Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit is a weird card. It has applications against every matchup, but I feel like those applications are either a little bit too small in terms of their impact, or they are very late into the combo so that you still lose to the other things that they've made. So for example, against Yummy, you are forced to basically use the Ghost Ogre very early and hope they can't play through it, which is very situational because it like depends 100% on their hand. If they start with Engage, if they start with Obedience Schooled, or if they start with like multiple Yummy names, they can always ignore Ghost Ogre, and you basically have to hope that you can go use Ghost Ogre on your own turn onto the Snatchy when they try to synchro with it. But usually, if they go for the combo, they have ways to play around that and get another Snatchy back. Like when you Ghost Ogre the Snatchy, they like tag out with the Synchro to bring back another Snatchy from the graveyard or something like that. So the Ghost Ogre can only ever do something if it's paired, which I think makes it a situationally good card against Yummy. Like it can work, but only if it's paired with other cards. The same is true against most other matchups, like against Mitsurugi, for example. The card has very few applications, but the one application it does have is you can Ghost Ogre IP Masquerena, which is not bad. But it's probably going to cost you 2 cards in hand because they have Murakumo. Yes, you can Ghost Ogre the IP, but can you beat Prayers, Magatama, Murakumo, and the Nibiru they have in hand because they search it off Gallant Granite? Probably not. I think Ghost Ogre is situational. It's worth noting that against some Draco Tail variations, Ghost Ogre isn't that bad. Like against the Megistus version of Draco Tail, Ghost Ogreing the Cartesia or the Lucius is not actually a bad play. But I don't love Ghost Ogre. I think there is better hand traps in the format that have better coverage and more impact. We got some more breakers. Super Poly. Super Poly is a good card. I think it has very solid applications against most matchups. I'd have to look into exactly what things you can hit against Draco Tail. I mean, if you play something like Mysterion or Secretarion Dragon, you can Super Poly into that for sure. Pretty good card against Yummy. Pretty good card against Mitsu. Pretty good card against Draco Tail. The caveat here is the same with Izuna. These 2 cards require significant extra deck space, and that is not something that every deck is willing to do. But if your deck can afford to play Super Poly, I think it's worth noting that it's a pretty good card. What I like about it is that it pairs pretty well with hand traps actually. So I think playing something like 9 hand traps and then Super Poly is not bad because you hand trap your opponent, they make a half board, you Super Poly the half board, you're good to go. And it's also a really good card going first because if you set it, it's really hard for some decks to play around it. So I like Super Poly. I think it's a decent card, and I could see people experimenting with it a decent amount. What's holding it back? Once again, decks like Yummy don't have extra deck space for it, because if you want to cover the entire meta, you need different targets. You need like 3-4 targets to cover the metagame. That's not that easy for most decks. Like Yummy doesn't want to do that. Draco Tail, depending on the version, also doesn't want to do that. Mitsurugi, if it plays Extravagance, can't really afford to do that. I think Extravagance is more important than Super Poly for Mitsurugi because consistency is more important than the breaker. You can find other breakers, but it's hard to find other consistency pieces for Mitsu. In theory, very good. In practice, I don't think we're gonna see that much of it, but some rogue decks might really be able to shine with Super Poly. Rescue Ace. Rescue Ace loses one of its main decks, which is basically Vanquish Soul, which I don't think is going to be that popular anymore. However, I will say I still think this card has solid applications in this format. I don't think the only deck that can play it is Vanquish Soul. I think some other decks might also want to play Rescue Ace Impulse. I think it's a pretty solid card for every deck that is scared of Herald of the Arclight, because you can just go put out a Fire Attacker, which is big enough to threaten the Arclight, and you'll just draw 2 cards and discard 1 in the process, which I think is pretty valuable for some cards. Like Draco Tail could use this as one of their non-engines because Draco Tail has problems with Arclight, and this just helps you filter your hand. You have a better chance at drawing cards like Nib, Phantasme, Phimena, and you have something that immediately forces them to interact with it because it's otherwise going to kill the Herald. So I think it's a decent card still. I don't know if it's higher priority than other non-engine for Draco Tail, like whether you want to play this or just like a straight up breaker for the Herald or just more hand traps to prevent the Herald. Like all of that is also something I can imagine, but I think Rescue Ace is still solid, especially in decks that have good discards too. Like someone is mentioning right now in Orchest, you could do that. I'm sure Orchest could play Impulse. Dark Ruler, I think, is a solid card. I don't like main deck Dark Ruler anymore. I liked it a lot last format. The K9 Vanquish Soul board, Dark Ruler kind of slapped. And against Yummy, Dark Ruler also slaps. I think the problem is that like in decks like Mitsu and in decks like Draco Tail, their back row just does way too much. So Dark Ruler is not good against them. And then also, of course, always the Dark Ruler problem, it's not good going first. So I personally wouldn't advise main decking Dark Ruler. I think it's a solid card to side deck if you're scared of Herald in the Yummy matchup. Once again, pretty good card against Yummy, pretty good cards against some rogue decks that make crazy boards. I do not like it main deck personally. Shifter I think is a card that I wouldn't main deck, probably, depending on how popular Mitsurugi is, because Mitsurugi doesn't really care about Shifter that much. If Mitsurugi is popular, then I don't think you want to main deck Shifter. However, Shifter is still a very good card because most of the decks that can play it should probably side deck it. That's how I would personally do it. Like, for example, if I was playing Mitsurugi myself, there's a high chance I'm putting a Shifter into my side deck because my deck doesn't care as much about it, but my opponent's decks probably do in the right matchup. So I'm side decking a Shifter, and whenever I draw it, I'm probably gonna win, right? And so, yeah, Shifter good in side decks, I think, if your deck can play it. Skullmeister, in theory, not a bad card against Mitsurugi. I struggle to see what it does against Yummy. Can be okay against Draco Tail, but I think overall just not enough applications, and you should always be playing another hand trap over it. Songs of the Dominators is a pretty situational card. I mean, only really Yummy can play it. That's the only deck that really wants to. Even in Yummy, the card I think has become significantly worse for a couple of reasons. First of all, Yummy now has a monster effect that they want to activate in hand sometimes with Marshmallow. So like the drawback of songs actually hurts you sometimes. And just in general, the decks right now are not super weak to songs. If a card like Imperm is already only in the solid category, Songs of the Dominators is basically a more situational version of Imperm. Like, it just doesn't stop the key things against decks like Draco Tail and Mitsurugi, right? Because most of the important stuff is happening in hand or in the graveyard or with the spell cards, and like this card just doesn't interact with those. So I don't love Songs of the Dominators right now. Triple Tactics Thrust, I think, is a very good card. This is like one of my favorite cards to play in those types of like hybrid variations between board breakers and hand traps. If I want to play like 9 or 12 hand traps, but then like some board breakers on top. For example, in Yummy, this is something I've been doing. Play some hand traps and then also play Thrust, because Thrust is one of the best cards you can use going second to break a board, because you can either search like Talents to break the board, or you can search Obedience, Schooled, or Engage to extend. So I've been liking Thrust a lot in something like Yummy. And in other decks, I could see it doing the same thing if you can search solid extenders for going second. Like, hypothetically, a deck like K9 Vanquish Soul, for example, could use this to search like Stake Your Soul going second when you're playing into a board. Of course, it's not an attribute, but I still think like it being a board breaker and a consistency card at the same time when you're going second is really nice for decks like that. And of course, decks like Sky Striker are always going to play Thrust. I like it a lot. Effect Veiler. Effect Veiler is just versed and Imperm in every deck that isn't Draco Tail. In Draco Tail, I think Veiler still has its place. Overall, it is a solid card. I could see it being played in Yummy. It can be kind of used as like a starter. I mean, it's part of some 2-card combos with like Almirage or Linkaribo, so I don't hate it in Yummy and Draco Tail. I think for most other decks, you're just going to choose other cards from up here over Veiler, but it's not bad. It's not bad in Draco Tail, but not my highest priority, I would say. Crossout Designator. Crossout Designator is a pretty situational card at the moment, because other than Called by the Grave, this card is essentially completely useless going second unless you're playing a mirror match or your opponent just happens to play the same hand traps as you are. The problem is a lot of the hand traps that people are using right now might not be in your deck. You play against a deck that has Dominus Impulse like Mitsurugi, you might not have Dominus Impulse in your own deck, so you can't cross it out. Same with Purge against Yummy, same with Songs against Yummy, same with Fuva, because sometimes you go first, you don't want to keep Fuva in your deck. Of course, you can do that. Retaliating Sea, am I going to put a Retaliating Sea into my Draco Tail deck going first just to cross out the Retaliating with my one crossout in a deck? That doesn't seem like good deck building. So I think most of the time, this card can only really negate like the super popular cards like Ash, Nib, or Imperm or whatever if you play those cards yourself, which if your deck really struggles with Ash, then I guess you're gonna play Crossout just for that, but it's not very flexible. It's hard to hit the non-engine right now because decks just have different non-engine from each other. Dominus Purge goes right next to Dominus Impulse because both of these cards, the same thing is true. If your deck can't play them, you should play them. I think Dominus Impulse is slightly better in terms of the cards it can stop, but still Dominus Purge, extremely good card against Mitsurugi, extremely good card against Draco Tail because you can hit K2 with it. Of course, Impulse can hit K2 and Rahu, but still Purge is really good. Hits consistency against Lunalight, right? You can purge Tenki, you can purge Gold Leo, and maybe they can't play. Very, very good. Magnamut. Magnamut is a good card this format. I like it. I don't know if you should main deck it, but I think it has very solid applications. Good against Mitsurugi, good against Lunalight, good against Yami. Specifically, Magnamut I think is awesome in Draco Tail, so I would recommend playing Magnamut in Draco Tail for sure. In other decks, you know, you can play Bystials, you don't have to, but I do think they have very solid applications. I don't know if I would main deck them in most decks outside of Draco Tail. I probably wouldn't, but I think they are a consideration for the side deck. The question is just, are they better than something like Bell or Retaliating Sea or whatever in some of the matchups, which is like probably not, so they might not have the highest priority. But I do think in something like Draco Tail, they're exceptionally strong. Basically, if your deck has a target for Magnamut, I would play Magnamut. I don't know about a full Bystial package, but Magnamut is very good right now. Speaking of a good Bystial target, I like Phantasme still. I think it is a solid card right now that you could even consider main decking. It's a little situational in the main deck because not every deck is going to play into it right away. Like, for example, Draco Tail is going to make a Seals, so the Phantasme is going to be live, but that's like relatively late into the turn. I like it against Yami, but at the same time, Yami does play Thrust usually, or at least I would play Thrust in Yami, so I'm a little scared of that. But I think playing a package of one Magna, one Phantasme is a very reasonable thing to do, specifically Draco Tail, but also in other decks. I like that. Change of Heart is a solid card, I think. It's between solid and situational. It's like you can only side deck it. You can only side deck it for going second. And even when you do go second and you do draw Change of Heart, all it really does is like relatively low impact, right? It's like, okay, against Draco Tail, I can force the Seals or the Flame. Against Yami, I can force the Herald, which depending on the deck could be good enough for a reason. But like, it outs Baguska against Lunalight because you can take it and turn it to attack. So has applications. Don't know if I think the impact is good enough. Chaos Hunter. Chaos Hunter is mid. I don't think there's enough malice to justify it. With Lancia, at least you have other matchups that the Lancia can go in, like Lunalight or Crystron. I wouldn't advise playing Chaos Hunter for those matchups, so yeah. Dominus Spiral is not on the list. Dominus Spiral, I did not put on the list. You're right, I forgot about that. I think Dominus Spiral is a situational card because not a lot of decks can play it, but even if they could, I wouldn't. Right now is the problem. Dominus Spiral, for those of you that don't know, works a little bit differently than the other Dominus cards because the condition is a different one. Instead of being able to activate it when your opponent has a card on the field, your opponent has to have used an effect in hand or graveyard, and then you can bounce a monster back to the hand or extra deck. And then your opponent can revive something from the graveyard. And then you are locked into, you cannot use light or dark for the rest of this game, which means a lot of the meta decks can't play it. But even if your deck can play it, I think it's just not enough impact because most of the decks at the moment just don't make the craziest boards, right? Like, yes, you can end phase Dominus Spiral a Herratic Seals or an IP Masquerena, but at that point, like, I feel like you can do better with your non-engine. Contact C also seems decent with Retaliating Sea being viable. That's another good point. Contact C is I think I would rate Contact C as a situational card, but because Retaliating Sea is so good, I think a split of 3 Retaliating, 1 Contact is a pretty viable thing to do. Yeah, I don't hate that because then you have a search target for Retaliating Sea when they eventually out it. So I don't mind that. Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. I'm thinking about it just now, and if your deck has extra deck space, once again, extra deck space being a problem here with some of these non-engine cards, I think this card could be pretty solid. The problem is, like, against Yami, they have ways to play around it, but against Draco Tail, like hitting triple Arthalion is pretty good. They can recycle it though, right? Like the Draco Tail traps can put a banished Draco Tail card back, right? So maybe it's more like situational. I'm gonna put it in situational just because I haven't tried it personally, but I can see some applications. It's like an experimental card that could turn out pretty good. Obviously, it's nuts against Lunalight if you play a target, but like Draco Tail can recover from it, Yami can recover from it. The thing is, like, only because they can recover from it does not mean it's bad, because them recovering from it might still force them into some awkward lines. I know that's the case with Yummy. So by the way Yummy can out Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries is because the field spells, when they are in the graveyard, can put back banished Yummy monsters to the bottom as well to go back into the deck. If you banish the Snatchies for it, you can also go field spell in the graveyard and put 2 Snatchies back. Now, the thing is, setting up a field spell in the graveyard is not always that easy for Yummy. It's not trivial unless you draw one. If you draw a field spell, it becomes super easy because you can just discard it for a Yummy Cupsy way, Cupsy Yummy way, and then you have a field spell in the graveyard and then basic. So that's like inherently Yummy already has 2 outs in their deck immediately to Ghost Reaper, right? Because if they open one of the field spells, it's basically free to out the Ghost Reaper. And then sometimes, depending on how they start, if you Ghost Reaper them early and they still haven't searched with Cupsy Yummy, they might be able to special Cupsy, search a field spell, and then get that one into the graveyard. That can happen. So I think it's situational against Yummy. If they know the lines to play around it, it's not going to be that good. Same for Draco Tail somewhat. Yeah, it's good against Lunalight for sure. Like if you're thinking about like finding a like one card that beats Lunalight, Ghost Reaper is pretty strong. And what you do, by the way, is you don't hit the Liger Dancer, you hit the Leo Dancer. Because if the Leo Dancer is banished, they have no way to summon the Liger Dancer even. So Ghost Reaper is really strong there. The problem is you still have to deal with Baguska somehow. But then again, even if you can't out the Baguska that turn, I don't know what their win condition is in the long run. So you might be fine. DD Crow, it's not bad, right? Crow is not bad against Mitsu. Crow is, I wouldn't side it against Yummy. I wouldn't side it against Draco Tail. It's not bad against Lunalight. So it has applications against Luna, has applications against Mitsu. It's not bad against Striker. It's not terrible against Crystron, but probably not high impact enough. I think it's already in something like Draco Tail because you can recycle it and then use it over and over and over again, at which point you might be able to actually outgrind a lot of these decks, no problem. Not bad against Orchist, not bad against Fiendsmith, yeah. I don't think it's good enough against Yummy and Draco Tail to main deck it ever. And I don't know if it's good enough in the side deck against those other decks. Like, why play Crow if you can play other more targeted cards? But it's all right. Droll and Lockbird is a very good card. The reason why I'm not putting it in extremely good is because I don't recommend main decking it. I simply think there is some decks in the format that Droll and Lockbird just doesn't hit at all. Namely, Draco Tail and Yummy, where like Droll and Lockbird barely does anything against those decks. Like you have to be very lucky. Yeah, okay, if they start Engage, you might cut them off of one Cupsy search or like the Cupsy Yummy way search. Sure, that can be a little bit annoying sometimes, but it's overall not good enough, I don't think, against Yummy. It's okay, but like not great against Yummy. And it's not great against Draco Tail either. Like sure, if they start with Lucius and then you droll them, they might not be able to activate K2 later, but they're gonna find a way to play around that. Like that's not the problem. However, it's a very strong side deck card. You know, decks like Mitsurugi, decks like Lunalight, decks like K9, decks like Sky Striker are all in the format, and Droll and Lockbird is very, very strong against them. So it's a very high priority side deck card. Honestly, if you main decked Droll right now, I don't even think you'd be that crazy. If one of those matchups is what you really care about because it's really hard for your deck, then I think it's not even that bad to main deck Droll and Lockbird. In a deck like Draco Tail, it's a spellcaster, so you can fuse with it and make something viable out of it. In Yummy, it's a level 1, so you can normal it and make Linkaribo and then special your Yummies from hand. So like, it's not even that dead in those decks if you draw it in a matchup where you don't want it. I could see some people main decking it. I would mostly recommend siding it for now, unless there's a lot of Mitsu, which could be the case. But yeah, Forbidden Droplet, very good card. Another one of those cards similar to Super Poly that works really well even in decks that play a bunch of hand traps and then just play like a Droplet with it, because Droplet is really strong right now at handling half boards. You know, like you care about if you care about the Herald in Yummy, all you have to do is activate a spell and then chain Droplet. Against Draco Tail, you can Droplet the Altharion in your turn. That's really nice. Against Mitsurugi, Droplet the IP, Droplet the Murakumo, Droplet the Futsu. It's not going to win you the game on its own, but it's a pretty good non-engine card overall. I like Droplet a lot. The cards that tribute your opponent's shit. With Lunalight in the format, all of these cards have some applications. I think I'm gonna throw Ras Fear Mode and Lava Golem in situational. Not every deck can play them. It goes without saying that if your deck doesn't need the normal summon at all, then of course these cards are better than Kaijus. Kaijus I'm gonna put in solid. I think every deck, with no exception, in this format should have an out to Lunalight in their side deck or main deck if possible. Like, if you can't find anything that your deck can do with its engine to out the Lunalight stuff, then play some Kaijus. In some decks, they're even good against other matchups. Like, for example, in Draco Tail, the most important thing against Yami is outing the Herald anyways, so just play some Kaiju. But then at the same time, you have an actual win condition against the Lunalight deck. If you play Thrust, you can side the Ruma Cannon. You can do that, but I don't think that's super reliable against Lunalight because they have a Spell Trap negate, right? They have Lunalight Silverhound in the graveyard, so if you can't force that somehow, Karma Cannon is not going to help you. So I don't know. But yes, you need a way to handle the Liger Dancer this format. I think if you... okay, it's one thing to lose against Lunalight because you didn't draw your answer. That's fine. But like losing to Lunalight because your deck straight up didn't have an answer, I think is not something that should happen this format. There should always be an out somewhere in your deck. Kurikara, on the other hand, I'm just not a big fan of right now because I don't like that your opponent has to activate the effects before you can actually use the Kurikara. I just don't think that's good against the current decks in the format. It's not bad against Yami, I think. However, against Lunalight, I don't want to wait for my opponent to Raigeki my board before I can actually out the Liger Dancer. Also, it's worth noting that yes, I probably should have put Dogoran as the picture because Dogoran is the one that most decks can search because you can go Hita and crash into something and then search Dogoran. So Dogoran is probably going to be the most common kaiju. In this case, if your deck can make Hita, you might not even have to play 3 kaijus, then 1 is already enough if you can make Hita. Lightning Storm goes next to Duster. I think it's a solid card this format, but I wouldn't main deck it. Cards like Dark Ruler, Lightning Storm, and Duster all have very solid applications post side. I don't think they are good in the main deck. It's also worth noting that Lightning Storm went to 3, so you can play a more consistent like strategy now with Lightning Storm post side. You're going to see it more often. I think that's good. So you can play upwards of 3 Lightning Storm, 1 Feather Duster to deal with back row, which I think is pretty solid. Nibiru. Nibiru is weird right now. I'm not gonna lie to you. There is a couple of matchups where I would classify Nibiru as a very good card. Like against Yami, for example, I like Nibiru a lot. Against Lunalight, Nibiru is also a pretty solid card to pair with other hand traps. Like, of course, alone, they can play around Nibiru, but as soon as you pair Nibiru, it becomes pretty strong. It's also one of the strongest hand traps to have when you're going first. You make an half board, you have Nibiru behind that. Very powerful. Also a very good card in Draco Tail. I like it a lot in Draco Tail specifically as well. Problem with Nibiru is that some decks in the format can play around it surprisingly well. Draco Tail and Mitsurugi have some really good lines around Nibiru, but that's also usually only when they go first. When they go second, Nibiru can hit them pretty hard. So I like it actually. Maybe it goes up a little bit. I'm putting Nibiru up here. I think Nibiru is good. I don't know if you should main deck it in every deck. There's some decks it has anti-synergy with. Like for example, if you play Yami and you play the Sky Striker cards, you might not want to play Nibiru. If you play a deck with Dominus Impulse, I think you should think about playing Nibiru because Dominus Impulse is usually a hand trap you want to use early, like on K2, Rahu, Mitsurugi Ritual. Like you want to use that impulse early. You don't want to hold it because you have Nib in your hand. It's a very awkward pairing. Still think overall it classifies as a pretty good hand trap if you also consider the fact that it's really good going first. Pankratops. Solid side deck option. I like it. I still think it's good against Yami. Once again, I keep saying this about Yami, but I really think in some matchups, it's all about the Herald of the Arclight, and Pankratops is one of the most consistent outs to Herald of the Arclight. So if your deck doesn't care about Yami, but cares about Arclight, then Pankratops is your way to go. Like Draco Tail, I think it's a good card in Draco Tail because you can just go special Pank, pop Herald, activate K2, and you're good to go. Yeah, I like Pank. I think it's solid. If your deck doesn't care about Herald, you probably shouldn't play Pankratops. But it's nice too that you just happen to have an out to Floodgates as well in your deck. Like if you play Pankratops, if you ever feel like there's a matchup that's really good for you, but you could lose if they draw like Rivalry, Gozen or whatever, then you can go Pank. Don't they have Linkaribo now? Yeah, but like you're not trying to attack over the Herald. You just summon Pank, activate effect, and then the Herald is gone. Then you play. So it's fine. The spell card Monster Reborn is a card that was played a little bit during Mitsurugi format, which is why I'm bringing it up right now. It's a situational card, but I don't hate it against the Mitsurugi matchup. And you can like use it in some decks. It can be a pretty good extender too. Like if you play like a Draco Tail Mirror or something, you can like steal something from their graveyard maybe and make use of it. A card that I haven't thought about too much, but I can see it have some applications against some decks in the format. You can steal Yami cards in the mirror match, sure, like steal your opponent's Snatch patchy or something, right? That which can help you play through, like when they book your board or something, or bounce your board, you can maybe extend with this. Maybe some applications for spell card Monster Reborn. I don't hate it. It's like a very budget version of Cult by the Grave, but Cult by the Grave is very good. So maybe a budget Cult by the Grave can still work out. I could see it. Ultimate Slayer. Ultimate Slayer is solid. It goes into the exact same category as Dark Ruler and Lightning Storm. Wouldn't recommend main decking it, but I think for the right matchup, it's a very solid side deck card. Problem, once again, extra deck space, right? Like, we're looking at some really high quality extra deck cards, non-engine cards here in the form of like Izuna, Super Poly, Ultimate Slayer, but all of them require extra deck space and cherries to an extent, right? So like you just can't choose many of them. You have to pick and choose. But I think Ultimate Slayer is a solid card going second. You can definitely do that. Send Herald, add Habakiri. I mean, if you play Mitsu and you want to side Herald against Yami, yeah, that's broken, right? Like you go Ultimate Slayer, send your own Herald of the Arclight. That cooks. Like that's nice. So yeah, definitely has some solid applications. I like it. Talents. Talents is an awesome card this format. I like Talents a lot, especially in formats where decks make kind of breakable boards, which I think is the current format. I think Draco Tail, Yami, and Mitsurugi all make boards that can be broken reasonably, even with like strong engine and board breaker hands. Talents is perfect in these kinds of formats because you just like all the options are viable right now. Sometimes you want to take a look at their hand, take out the hand trap so you can keep playing. And it's a good card going first. It's a good card going second. It's quite literally one of the best non-engines in the format right now, which I'm throwing it up there. Metaltronus. Metaltronus is a pretty solid card, I would say. Once again, it is a little bit weird to main deck because you need to play a lot of very specific targets for it. But if you do that, then I guess it's really strong. The reason why I'm definitely putting it in solid is because I think it's a very, very strong card in the Yami Mirror match, from what I've heard, because you can use it to negate something and also extend at the same time. So basically the things that I've talked about with spell card Monster Reborn, you can do with Metaltronus, but better. You get a body and you negate a body. So I think Metaltronus is pretty solid for that. In other decks, I'm not sure if I would play Metaltronus. Like in Draco Tail or Mitsu or whatever. I don't think Metaltronus outvalues these other cards. But yeah. So what we're left with is like a landscape where some of the best cards in the format are still hand traps, like specifically Ash, the Dominus cards, and Fuba are pretty good. But board breakers they definitely have a spot in this format. I think a mix between some hand traps, Droplet, Thrust, Super Poly, whatever, can be very, very potent. And in general, I also wouldn't be surprised if we see some decks with just in general lower non-engine counts. Like, it's completely reasonable to play a deck with like 12 hand traps and like 28 engine or something like that, depending on how strong your engine is. Like, for example, Draco Tail. I don't think Draco Tail needs to play like 20 hand traps to compete in this format. You can just play like 9 or 12 and play extra engine, like extra pushes, extra patchwork, extra Cartesia, extra poly, whatever. Like, I think that's realistic. I think it's a pretty interesting format in that sense, because you are not forced to play infinite non-engine to compete with people. Of course, there are still decks that can do that, like Yami, for example, has a lot of non-engine space, but you're not forced to play those decks. You can play Draco Tail with more engine. You can play Mitsu with more engine. You can play Lunalight, which has a lot of engine. K9 Crystron also doesn't have that much non-engine. So yeah, I think it's interesting. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you watched on YouTube, I hope you enjoyed the little bit of a discussion for the new format. Let me know what you think about non-engine choices coming up for YCS Lille and YCS Anaheim. Until then, hope you found this helpful. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe. We are headed to 100,000 subscribers. It would really mean a lot to me if we hit that soon-ish. So yeah, show me some support by hitting that subscribe button if you're not subscribed yet. Without further ado, I'll see you next time, duelists, and thank you for watching.